The KGB, who they were and what they did. The KGB was the main government intelligence and security agency of the Soviet Union from 1954 until its fall in 1991. The Soviet Union was made up of 15 republics: Russia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. In some republics, the KGB didn't work directly, but there were similar organizations carrying out the same duties. The KGB had two divisions, intelligence services and military units, that were entirely separate from the Soviet armed forces. They functioned as a completely independent government body. And while the KGB portrayed itself as the USSR's intelligence agency, it was also a form of secret police, ensuring people all across the republics stayed aligned with Soviet ideals. And political dissidence was handled quietly, and often lethally. KGB stands for Komitet Gosudasvenoi Bezopasnosti, which translates to Committee for State Security in English. The most well-known former KGB agent alive today is Russian President Vladimir Putin. In March 1954, the KGB replaced the existing MVD, which had been in place the year before, and had such highly informed and effective agents of espionage that Joseph Stalin knew far less about his own operatives than those working for the UK and the US. Over the course of the war and beyond, Soviet intelligence agencies had thousands of global spies operating in numerous countries, and at one point, it was the largest organization of its kind. But at home, they were feared, often compared to Germany's World War II secret police, the Gestapo. Political dissidents, those who spoke out against communist ideals or the government, frequently found their homes searched and themselves arrested at best. As the world moved into the Cold War, this only escalated, with the KGB keeping tabs on both private and public opinions of Soviet citizens. After the war, waves of anti-communist sentiment spread across the West, heightening the tensions of the intensifying Cold War between the Soviets, Europeans, and Americans. This became known as the Second Red Scare. The first had occurred decades earlier, between 1917 and 1920, before the KGB even existed. During this time, Americans realized the sheer number of Soviet spies living across the US, both legally and illegally. They feared what these agents might do to their society and political structure, a particular fear of Senator Joseph McCarthy, who led investigations that triggered hundreds of accusations of treason and subversion. The exact number of victims of McCarthy's relentless hunt for Russian spies is unknown, but estimates suggest hundreds were imprisoned, and over 10,000 lost their jobs after being questioned. As a result, during the early 1950s, the number of Soviet spies in America fell drastically, with the last major illegal operative, Rudolf Abel, being betrayed by his assistant in 1957. Still, back home, the KGB continued tightening control over Soviet society. In the 1960s, thanks to U.S. naval officer and political dissident John Anthony Walker, Soviet intelligence managed to decode thousands of U.S. Navy messages, giving them a significant military advantage if they chose to act on it. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 began as a protest by university students against the USSR and their strict Stalinist former leader, Matthias Rákosi. Prague Spring began in 1968, when Czechoslovakia tried to declare more independence from the USSR by reclaiming political authority within its own state. On both occasions, the Red Army of the USSR was quick to respond, invading the countries and killing thousands of protesters and civilians to suppress the uprising. As usual, the KGB swiftly and quietly worked alongside the Red Army and the USSR's other agents to destabilize the revolts. In Czechoslovakia, they penetrated pro-democratic organizations to weaken political support and reported back to the Soviet leadership. On October 29, 1956, in Hungary. A report by KGB chief Ivan Serov falsely claimed that armed groups were hunting down communists and killing them, along with any state security officials they found. The Hungarian military leader, PL Melanter, responded by arranging a diplomatic meeting between a Hungarian delegation and the USSR. During the midnight of that same evening, Serov ordered the arrest of the Hungarian delegation. The next day, after the removal of their leader by the KGB, the Soviet army struck Hungary again. The uprising was crushed just 7 days later, officially ending on November 11, 1956. After the revolt was over, Serov and the KGB continued to watch Hungary closely, once again using tactics to track any internal dissent. By 1964, the head of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, had fallen out of political favor. He had condemned Stalin years earlier, a shocking move for the USSR, and had begun dismantling Stalin's policies. This, combined with his later handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, led other senior officials and KGB chief Vladimir Kryuchkov to plan his removal. Unlike most former leaders of the USSR, Khrushchev did not meet a tragic end. On October 13th, when he arrived at Vnukovo Airport, he was met by Kryuchkov and other coup leaders, who escorted him to the Kremlin with little resistance from Khrushchev himself. 24 hours later, the premier announced his supposedly voluntary departure from power. He spent the remainder of his life in a home funded and monitored by the KGB, who documented his every conversation and all visitors who entered. Khrushchev spent his last years writing memoirs that the KGB tried relentlessly to seize. In 1970, after he was hospitalized, the agency instead targeted his son, who eventually surrendered his father's original memoir notes, having already smuggled copies to a Western publisher, much to the KGB's frustration. In the 1970s, the KGB became increasingly active in South Asia. They shaped political opinion in the newly created Bangladesh starting in 1973, with the rise of its first president, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Initially democratic, just 2 years later, Mujibur established a one-party state. The KGB's influence grew rapidly across the rest of the decade, despite Mujibur's reign ending abruptly 6 months later, when he and most of his family were assassinated during a coup. This didn't halt KGB involvement in Bangladesh. However, by the decade's end, the number of Soviet operatives in the region had more than doubled, and they had published numerous slanderous news stories attacking the newly appointed, West-friendly leader, President Ziaur Rahman. The KGB were deeply engaged in Afghanistan in the late 1970s. They had strongly shaped the country's political leadership and aimed to control it by placing a puppet president in power. But their plan failed when the second president, Hafizullah Amin, took over the country. They found themselves unable to control or manipulate his leadership. He wrote memos in English and frequently spoke with the United States. Eventually, the KGB accused him of being an American spy and launched the successful operation of Storm 333, where they assassinated Amin, marked the beginning of the Soviet-Afghan War. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Over the previous years, the states had grown into looser republics, eventually leading to the full breakup of the Union, much to the KGB's dismay. In August 1991, the chairman of the KGB, Vladimir Kryuchkov, launched a coup against Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev alongside other Soviet officials. Their goal was to restore centralized Soviet authority in Russia, stripping away the expanded liberties that had been granted to the Soviet states. Ultimately, 2 days later, they failed, marking the final closing stages of the complete dissolution of both the Soviet Union and the KGB itself.